Shalom, how you doing? My name is Ruben, and I want to welcome you to the website. And as I typically say, if you access this video from YouTube and you're not at the website, allow me to give you the web address so you can visit it. Check out the articles and the videos that I have posted on it. There's some very important topics being discussed there. Topics that are not only important, but are a matter of salvation. Things that people have to understand in order to be saved. I won't go into a list of them now, but I really encourage you to visit the website. It's The Remnants of Israel. 4 words. The Remnants, R-E-M-N-A-N-T, of Israel.org, O-R-G. What I'm going to talk about today is not so important. I mean, the things discussed in the scriptures are extremely important. What I'm going to talk about today is a personal testimony of mine. And I'm telling you, I think this is the first time in 37 years that I've ever done this. I don't talk about my past a whole lot. There's a verse in Luke chapter 14, I believe. The Messiah said, "No man putting his hand to the plow and looking back is fit for the kingdom." And I think I've always understood that passage as to mean, don't look back on the things that you've done. You know, just keep moving forward. Which is pretty much what I've done. All the glory to the Almighty. That's pretty much what I've done for the last 37 years, roughly. And what I want to talk about today is I want to talk about some of my past, not in an attempt to, any way whatsoever, to be in a good way, because most of it wasn't good. And I want to talk about it, though, to give you an idea. A couple from Norway, a Norwegian couple, wrote me the other day. They asked me, they said they want to know a little bit about me. I think they were watching the videos on the website. Anyway, I met them at a Bible study in Tiberias that I was given about 6 years ago, this couple that I'm referring to. Very, very sweet people. Very nice people. So I wrote them back, and I said a little bit about my past, which I'm going to mention here in this tape. And they wrote back, and I think they developed this whole scenario about what my past was like by the few things that I said there. And I was telling somebody else that yesterday, a friend of mine, and she's saying that I should put this testimony out there, that it might help some people that feel as though they can't come to the Almighty for whatever reason. Maybe they feel they've done something in their past or whatever, and they feel like they're not worthy, possibly. That absolutely is not the case. And that's the reason I want to tell my story a little bit here. I'm not going to go into details that I think would shock some people. Some of what I'm going to say may shock you to begin with, but in my mind it wasn't. It's things that I can reveal now. Other things that I couldn't reveal now, such as fights I may have gotten into and things that I may have done in the past that I don't want to talk about, I don't want to think about. Yeah, but I'm going to mention some of that. And then I want to get to the point where the Almighty got a hold of my life, where He gave me that proverbial knock on the door, so to speak, and how my whole life just got turned around. I'm talking about in a matter of a minute. I'm not exaggerating when I say that. I'll explain it as I go along here. But He got a hold of my life, and my life just turned completely around. I mean, from the way I was, the things I was involved in, into what He started developing in me. So He gave me that knock at the door, and I started seeking Him by reading His Word, and that's where I'm at today in Jerusalem, 30-some years later, waiting for the Messiah to come back, and I believe He's coming back very soon. I know a lot of you may not believe this, but I think most people that I explain it to and why I believe He's coming back very soon agree with me. I'm talking about months, not years. I believe the way things are developing on the border over here with Syria, with Russia, I'd love to go into detail about it now. Russia, Syria, China. China has a warship in Syria with fighter planes on it. Russia has an anti-defense missile system on the border of Syria here, not too far from where we're sitting. They put that anti-missile defense system in Iran. What that means is that nothing can come into that area. That missile defense system they put up is the most sophisticated in the world. It can shoot down a rocket 250 miles away. A rocket, an airplane, even a cruise missile. For those that don't know much about the news or don't follow the news a whole lot, that's incredible. What that means is that once they set this system up, which they have set up, it's going to be impenetrable. Israel's not going to be able to, when an attack happens, I'll explain it more in detail later in another video or something, but yeah, there's no question in my mind that the end is very close. And I believe Zechariah 13 and 14 is about to be fulfilled. I know many Christians think that Matthew 24 has to be fulfilled yet, and Revelation, and some aspects of it, of course, too. But for the most part, it's all been fulfilled already. Matthew 24, I think, can go through and list there point after point after point that the things that Messiah is talking about have definitely come to pass already. So I believe all that has to happen is Zechariah 13 and 14. I'm saying more about that than I want to. That's when the Almighty is going to call the nations against Israel. And eventually the Mount of Olives is going to be split over here, and the Messiah is going to split the Mount of Olives, and it's my prayer to the Almighty, and I believe he's going to answer that prayer. I want to be at the base of that Mount of Olives, which is about maybe a 20-minute walk from where I'm sitting here. I want to be at the base of the Mount of Olives when the Messiah comes back, and I really believe he's going to answer that prayer for me. So again, I want to go from where I was, from when the Almighty got a hold of my life, into where I'm at today, sitting here. So let me start at the beginning, I guess. I can't go through the whole 64 years of my life, obviously, but this is going to take more than a half hour, I can assure you that. So when I grew up in the projects in Cleveland, Ohio. It was our backyard was a steel mills. That was our backyard. That was our playground. My mother was on welfare at the time, and welfare wasn't quite like it is today, where they give you all this food stamps and vouchers and money. Now, at that time, you had to go down to the local office and pick up a can of dehydrated eggs. You know, beans, macaroni and beans was pretty much a staple in our lives at that time. Friday nights, my mother would chop up potatoes and fry them, make potato chips, and we'd split it. We'd just buy a quart of, at the time it was a quart, it wasn't a liter. They're talking quite a few years ago. A quart of Pepsi or something, we'd have a glass of pop and chips on a Friday night. That was our big event. I'm just saying that we didn't have a whole lot of money. Not that I'm very appreciative for everything the Almighty's done in my life. And at the time I grew up like that, I never thought anything else of it. I thought everybody lived this way. I had no idea that the rest of the world wasn't living just like we were living at the time. We didn't have videos and television and internet and so forth, so we didn't see what was going on in the world at the time. That was our world. That was our world. We lived there in the projects. And so that's the way I grew up. When I was about 8 or 9 years old, my father left when I was probably about 10. He wasn't a nice guy. He died, I think, about 10 years ago or something in a halfway house up in Minnesota or someplace, Minneapolis, Minnesota. But he used to put my mother in the hospital quite a few times, beating her up and so forth. He was not a nice man. I'll tell you, I'm going to get thinking about some of the things I want to talk about. It's a little emotional for me, I think. Primarily because of when I think of what the Almighty got me out of and where he brought me to, it really is an emotional thing. So some of the stories I'm going to tell you, I may have to pause, and I think if I do, I'm going to clip these things out of the video. So if you see a clip there, you know what's happening. And also, I'm sitting in a place here, it's a park across from the old city, like I said. I'm looking at the walls around the old city in Jerusalem now. But it's a beautiful park, and there's a walkway in front of me, and oftentimes a tourist group might come by, or people might come by. And for the most part, I'll just keep on talking, unless there's a lot of people and they're making a lot of noise, and I might pause at that point, so you'll know what's going on if that happens. So anyway, like I said, my father was not a nice man. When I was 8 or 9 years old, I got in a fight. I came home and I was crying because another little boy beat me up, and my father slapped me and told me next time the other little boy better be crying, not me, and that I shouldn't be a crybaby. That was my father. And one time I remember, let me see if I can get through this story without getting emotional. One time I remember we were sitting there in the front room, me and my 3 sisters, playing in a big empty cardboard box. And my father, of course, was yelling at my mother, and he said he was going to cut her throat. So like I said, I may be editing some of these moments out of the video, so if you see that, that's what happened. So what I did at 8 or 9 years old, however old I was at the time, I went in the kitchen and this portion's going to have to get cut out. Okay, let me finish that story. So at 8 or 9 years old, when he threatened to cut my mother's throat, I went in the kitchen. I hid every knife I could find. And the next day, he left that night. He'd be out every night. The next morning, well, he wasn't even living there at the time, because my mother had a restraining order against him. So when he would come over, so let me pick up where I left off there. So at the time, my father, when he threatened to cut my mother's throat, I went in the kitchen. I hid every butter knife, every knife I could find. And the next morning, my father was gone, and my mother's getting up and she's looking for the knives. I put them all in the corner of the closet so he couldn't get one and cut her throat with it. And at 8 or 9 years old, I believe that was a possibility. And even to this day, I think with him it was a possibility. So like I said, he wasn't a nice guy, so that's pretty much the way I grew up. So we moved to another neighborhood. We got out of the projects, moved to another neighborhood, and that neighborhood had every corner, every neighborhood had a gang at that time. And the neighborhood I moved into had a gang as well. I remember the first time in the playground. There was a playground there, and there must have been one. I was maybe 14 years old. And there was probably 100 people there, 100 guys in there, all 15, 16, 17, 18, maybe as old as 20 years old, which was old at the time. I mean, from a 14-year-old's point of view. So anyway, they were going to have a gang fight. That's what was going on. They were waiting for another rival gang to show up, and there was going to be a fight. Well, about 10, 15 police cars came, and they circled the playground, and everybody ran. Everybody was there. I wasn't part of this group at the time. I was sitting across the street watching it. And everybody ran, and the police found they dropped whatever weapon they had. Police, I remember they found a machete, they found knives. I think they even found a sawed-off shotgun laying there. Because when the people ran, they didn't want to get caught with this weapon in their hands. They got caught. So what I'm saying is every neighborhood had a gang, so I eventually became part of that. Part of that gang. And looking back, it wasn't like, it's kind of hard to explain, but when you're part of it, it doesn't seem so drastic. It doesn't seem so out of the ordinary, I guess. Like being in Vietnam, not to get off the subject here, but I was in Vietnam. I'm glad I went. I'm glad I experienced the things I experienced over there. I mean, to say you're over there, a lot of people have this, and it is. It's not a nice place, obviously. But I'm saying when you're there, it just doesn't seem as drastic as when you're actually involved in it. Like sitting in Jerusalem right now. Pretty much every day there's a terrorist attack going on. Right here at the Jaffa Gate, 2 people got killed yesterday. I'm looking at the Jaffa Gate right now. It's 10 minutes away. It's usually a secured area. So, I mean, they happen every day, but life goes on. And sitting here, I think it sounds worse to people reading the news, and it's a terrible thing, people dying, of course. But I'm saying, I think to people reading it in the newspaper, it sounds a little worse than, how can it be worse than people getting killed? What am I trying to say here? I'm trying to say it's, you get used to it, I guess, is what I'm looking for. You get used to these things. So when I belonged to a gang in the neighborhood, I got used to it. It wasn't like something out of the ordinary, and again, I thought this was the way people grew up. I didn't know any better at the time. So we got in fights. We got quite a few fights. I think our pride and joy in our gang was a shotgun. It wasn't sawed off, but a shotgun that we had. Never shot anybody with it, but it was impressive at the time. So that's how I grew up. But I got in quite a few fights, like I said, that I can't go into and talk about. You know, my mother used to always say I would never live to see my 21st birthday. On my 21st birthday, I woke up in the intensive care unit of a hospital. And the night before, I had got stabbed in a street fight. So I had a cut through my stomach and into my liver. So they were pretty. So I think about that as I talk about this. I think about it, and I think about all that the Almighty brought me through. So they thought I was going to die that night. My family was there, my stepfather, my girlfriend. I was positive I was going to die that night. You know, we were brought up Catholics, and I quit the Catholic Church 3-4 years prior to this, and I'll explain why in a moment. I hope I remember to explain why in a moment. So we were brought up Catholic, so a Catholic priest was called in to give me my last rites. So he comes in with his holy water and his white collar around his neck, and he had like a white scarf or something on. And he's going to sprinkle me with the water. And I remember laying there thinking to myself, well, I said to him, I didn't think to myself, but I said to him, I said, you know what, we could skip that part. You know, we don't have to go there. Because I thought the whole thing was a joke, which to this day I believe was a joke. At that time I didn't believe in, quote, a God. I would have been an agnostic. I thought the idea of a God was not silly, but it was like to think that he cared about me. That just didn't make any sense. I didn't believe that. When somebody talked to me about God or come up and try to witness to me about the Bible or something, my response to them would be, you know what, you're afraid of dying. If you think believing in this God you believe in is going to make you feel better when you die, then do it. That's what you need. I don't need that. I'm not afraid of dying. And that was my response. And that was a true answer. I wasn't afraid of dying. Dying didn't bother me. Not that I'm brave. I think I'm not trying to sound brave or anything like that. It's kind of stupid when you think about it. It's not a brave thing. It's kind of a ridiculous thing. I mean, that was my attitude. And so I didn't believe in a quote of God at that time. I knew there had to be something. I would have been an agnostic, not an atheist. I believe something had to start all this. You know, everything I'm looking at, that just happened by chance? Of course not. Something had to bring it all into motion. So I believe there had to be something. But to think that there was some supreme being that actually cared about me, that made no sense at all. So as I was laying there, and the priest came in to give me my last rites, he says, I says, you know what, we can skip this. You know, we don't got to go through this. Thanks anyway. And I really thought I was going to die. Keep that in mind. My stepfather came in, who didn't like me at all, and he was crying. So I knew something was drastically wrong. You know, if he was crying about me. So I found out later on that came out a couple times that night and told my mother that I wasn't going to make it through the night. So anyways, the priest is walking away. I stopped him. I said, wait a minute. Maybe if you don't mind, yeah, come back and do that. I said, if there is a hell or a purgatory, which I didn't believe in, of course. I said, if there is a hell or a purgatory, maybe sprinkling that water will keep me out of it, you know. So no, go ahead and do what you're going to do. So he gives me my last rites, and he says his prayer, whatever he says, and that was it. Then they wheeled me in front of the operating room, and I had IVs in my arm at the time, an IV in my arm. And the nurse came in and she injected something into the IV. It's an intravenous tube. And she injected some. I asked her what it was, and she said it was sodium pentothal. Well, I've had that in the past with operations that I've had, which I'll discuss in a moment, some of them anyway. And I knew that was going to knock me out in about 10 seconds. I was going to be out. You know, that's an anesthetic, I think is the right word. But it knocks you out before an operation. So before they wheeled me in the operating room, she gave me this sodium pentothal. And I knew I was going to be out, and I'm thinking, well, if there's a hell, I'm going to eventually know a lot of people there, which I didn't believe in hell anyway, but I thought if there was, I'm not the worst guy that I know, so eventually I'm going to know a lot of people there. And I thought if there's nothing, if I shut my eyes for the last time and I just cease to exist, I'm not going to know that either. So it's really, here we go. I'm going to find out what it's all about. So I remember laying there in the operating room, but I was thinking that. It's exactly what's going through my head. And I was fighting to keep my eyes open. I was struggling like this because I was getting so I couldn't keep them open. And finally, it was like taking a plunge. It was like, here it goes. Now I'm going to find out what dying is all about. So I shut my eyes, and obviously I didn't die. I woke up in the intensive care unit. Excuse me, on my 21st birthday. So my mother was almost right. I almost didn't live to see my 21st birthday. I can't imagine me putting this video out here with the emotionalism that I'm kind of going through right now. But we'll see. Again, if I clip these things out, you'll know what they're about. Why the break in the tape there. So anyway, my mother was almost right about not living to see my 21st birthday. But I did. I survived. I didn't get religious after that. The thought of God still made no sense to me. I didn't believe in a quote of God. I went back to the bars, to drinking, and everything else that I was involved in. This was after I got out of Vietnam. I was in Vietnam when I went to Vietnam when I was 18. I dropped out of high school, and I wanted to be the first one in my block to go to Vietnam. It was in the news every day, and I'm telling you, at the time, if it was exciting, I wanted to be there. And it looked exciting at the time, so I think I always thought to myself, too, looking back, is that if somebody else can do it, I can do it. If all these guys were over there and they were doing whatever they had to do, I could do it. And it's kind of how I felt about it. So I wanted to go over there, and I did. I joined the service, went to Germany for a while. Actually, in Germany, I put in for a leave to go to Italy, to the place with all the water there. I can't think. Oh, Venice, Italy. I was going to go to Venice, and the CO, the commanding officer, said, yeah, no problem. And then he called me back in that afternoon and said, there's been a change. I got orders to go to Vietnam. So I never got to Italy. And so anyway, I went to Vietnam, and that was a real experience. I'll tell you, it was really to see the way other people live. I've said after that ought to be like a requirement. Of course, it's impossible, but for young people to see how young people live in other countries, I mean, it's really an eye-opener. It really makes you appreciate, all that you have. I mean, I've literally seen people picking bugs out of people's hair and eating them. I mean, it was the conditions over there were incredible. I mean, that's the way people live. And again, they probably have no idea that the rest of the world is not living like that. At that time, they had no idea. Today, again, with television and internet, they know what the rest of the world looks like. So anyway, I got back from Vietnam, and all I learned in Vietnam, for the most part, was a lot of drugs. Marijuana was a regular staple over there in Vietnam. You know, heroin at the time was a big the drug of choice. So anyway, so I came back from Vietnam, and pretty much marijuana was still pretty much a part of my life for quite a while after that. So I'd go to bars and other drugs that I don't want to speed. They call LSD was out at the time. I'm not going to go into detail about these things and how they work and what they do, but LSD was out at the time. Speed, a thing they call it, you take a pill in the morning, it would keep you up for 12 hours, you're good for another 12 hours. If you took another one, you're good for another 12 hours. I mean, you could go days like that if you wanted to. So I was doing that, going to bars, drinking quite a bit, getting in a lot of fights. I enjoyed fighting at one time. I mean, I literally enjoyed fighting at one time. When I was about 16, I got beat up by a gang, maybe 15 even. I was walking down the street in Cleveland, and there's these 6'8" guys that 4 got on each side of the sidewalk, and I had to walk between them. When I walked between them, they just started punching and kicking me, and it messed me up pretty good. And I thought more happened to that story. I got some friends of mine, and we met one of the individuals, and anyway, there's more to that story. But after that, I thought, that's not going to happen again. I'm not going to get beat up like that again. So I took karate for a little bit, taekwondo for a little bit, and I enjoyed fighting at the time. So I got in quite a few fights that I can't go into because of some of the stories and the things that I've done in the fights, which I still, when I think about them to this day, I still repent of them. Can't go back and change it. But of course I could be forgiven for it. See, and these things never bothered me at the time. It wasn't like I was just defending myself. I mean, I didn't go picking on people. For instance, one time I worked in a bar. It was the bar where ironworkers came in the bar. It was known for, it was an ironworker bar. Ironworkers, if you're not familiar with the construction trade, they're the guys that walk on the steel beams like 500 feet, 1,000 feet in the air, sometimes higher, at the Empire State Building, the Terminal Tower. You know, so they have a reputation for being a little bit crazy. They like to think they're a little bit crazy anyway. I think it's more an act than anything else. I know quite a few ironworkers. I would have gotten into the ironworkers union if I had not gotten into the electricians union first. But because I knew these construction workers that came in this bar, that's how I got the job in the electricians union. And like I said, if I couldn't get into that, it would have been the ironworkers. What I'm saying is, working in this bar, there were quite a few times that were pretty crazy. I'll tell you, one time a fellow lost a pool game, and he got mad. He was known for having a little attitude, temper. He got mad, and he pulled out a pistol, and he shot the cue ball on the table. So, I mean, that was just, it wasn't, you know, he put his gun away, walked out, and that was it. The bar owner had to get another pool table. I mean, that's just the way people were. I got in a fight in there one time with a fella that, again, I didn't look for fights. I didn't go around picking on people. But if somebody walked in thinking they were something more than they were, then chances are him and I were going to get into it before he left. So I got in a fight with one fellow one time that way, and we were outside, and when the fight was over, he was somewhat of a bloody mess. And he left threatening to come back. When I walked in the bar, one of the fellas in the bar, a guy named Tiny, well, Tiny had a name of Tiny because he wasn't tiny, he was a big guy. But he had an overcoat on. When I walked back in, he told me, he said, he assured me, he said, don't worry if that guy comes back in. And he opened his jacket up, and he had a shotgun under his jacket, a sawed-off shotgun. Tiny was a drug dealer. Tiny wanted me to take over his route at one time, his drug route. He wanted me to come with him and show him the people, you know, and either help him out or take it over, which of course I had no desire to do. But Tiny had a shotgun. He said, if this fella comes back in, you know, he's telling me not to worry about it. So that was the bar I worked in. And I kind of that was one of the bars I worked in. I worked in a couple bars. So they had while I was working in the bar, they had what they had on TV, they called the Tough Guy Contest. You know, they were advertising, how tough are you? Well, we all thought we were tough. You know, so myself and a couple friends signed up for this Tough Guy Contest. And it was in the Coliseum in Cleveland. I think the Coliseum holds like 24,000 people, so it was a pretty big event. So we signed up for it, me and a couple friends of mine. I was the smallest guy there, second smallest guy there. I was 190 pounds and about 5'11". Not about, I was 5'11". Actually 5'11" and a half. So I signed up for this tough guy contest. And the reason I thought of that is because I went and told a woman one time at the doctor getting a physical taken that I was 6 foot. And she took my height and she says, well, you're not as big as you think you are. You're only 5'11". So that's how I remember the 5'11". But anyway, so I went to this thing and I signed up for this, and we went to the Coliseum, and it was like I said, there was 18,000 people there at the time. I was 190 pounds, 5'11", and I think the average weight was about 6'3" and 250 pounds. I was like the second smallest guy in the group. The long story of that too. Basically, I almost won it. I mean, people were 18,000 people I had on their feet rooting for me because they thought I was going to go all the way, which I possibly would have done if it wasn't for the man in charge of the whole affair, if I didn't get smart with him prior to the event happening. So he kind of arranged it that I was not going to win that thing no matter what. But anyway, because of that and because of the fights I got into, I had quite a reputation in the local union I belonged to, as an electrician's union. I was in a bar one time, and I worked in a, like I said, I was a doorman in a bar. And I'm telling these stories in a way not to be, just to show you, get to explain to you what I came out of. Like I said, and what the Almighty took me out of. And I'm telling you, it changed in a moment's time. I'm not exaggerating. I'll explain it when I get to it. But when I was going to the bars and doing the drugs, and I was pretty much always had a woman living with me at the time. I couldn't imagine myself without a woman, living with a woman at the time. So, I mean, that was my life. And there's quite a few things I was involved in, and I'll mention some of them here. But working in the bar one time, a bunch of electricians happened to be in the bar. It was a bar where they had the mechanical bull. Some of us may remember that. It was like a Mickey Gilley thing down in Texas, this mechanical bull they would ride. So it was a real cowboy bar. So these cowboys would come in, and they were all pretty good sized guys, and they all thought they were superheroes, I guess, or something. I'm not sure what, but they all had an attitude. And I was a doorman in the bar. So one night the barmaid said she had to cut a couple guys off because they were drunk. And I asked them politely to leave, and I says, it was kind of funny, maybe I'll mention. So they were big guys, about 6'2", I say, big guys. And I was standing next to them at the bar, and they're talking. The barmaid says, I'm going to have the doorman throw you out. And the guy's looking around, he says, where's the doorman? And I'm standing next to him, and he's much taller. I says, I guess that would be me. And I'm trying to reason with him. I'm saying, why don't you just leave? Come back tomorrow. She's not going to serve you. Why stay here? So we're going back and forth, and finally we got in a scuffle with me and the one fellow. He went out in his car, and I walked him to the door, and everybody's standing by the door. Well, he opened the trunk of his car, and he pulled out a shotgun, and he loaded the shotgun with the shells, and he pointed it at me. Well, everybody by the door, of course, cleared away from the door, and I stood there, and I was, some choice words, telling him, go ahead, pull the trigger. You think you're a tough guy, pull the trigger. You got it in you to do it. Go ahead, do it. You got the gun, pull the trigger. And I was kind of egging him on. Don't ask me why, because I was stupid at the time, I guess. Like I said, it wasn't being brave, it's being stupid. But anyway, because of things like that, now the electricians were there. I mean, stories like that get around construction jobs pretty fast. Another time I was in a bar, and I knew everybody in the bar. This will be the last bar story I tell you. I can go on and make a tape out of those, but just to give you an idea of where I was coming from again. Another time I was in a bar, and there was like 30 people in the bar. I knew everybody in the bar, and everybody in the bar knew me, except the bartender. It was his first night there. It was his first night working, so he was going to make an impression, I think, by acting like a tough guy. So it was last call in a bar, if you're familiar with the bar scene. At the end of the night, when the bar's about to close, they call last call. And I'm talking 30 years ago, 35, 37 years ago. So whatever I say now, the reason I think I don't talk about these things is because I don't want people to think that that's who they're talking to today. It has nothing to do with who I am today. So please, I pray that you don't think any less of me when I go through these stories here. And I hope that you continue on to the end and you see where the Almighty's got me today. So anyway, I knew everybody in the bar except the bartender. It was last call, so he comes around. I took my beer off the bar, put it on the floor because I was talking to an individual. And he come around, he picked my beer up off the floor and called me a punk. And I said, well, there's no reason to call me a punk. And he said, if you didn't have a broken arm, because I had my arm in a cast at the time. That's another story. I was riding the bull in the other bar. So anyway, I had my arm in a cast, and I said, there's no reason. He said, if I didn't have a broken arm, and I said, if I didn't have a broken arm, I think I'd kill you. And I pulled out a pistol with my other hand that I had in my pants, and I pointed it at him, and I shot a round off over his head. Well, everybody in the bar hit the floor, obviously, including this individual. And so the fella I was with, Jeff, he takes the gun from my hand. He said, "Man, give me that thing." And he takes it, and we walked out of the bar. And I found out later that like 3 cop cars came over, and they're looking for the bullet hole. And like I said, all those people in that bar knew me. If somebody would have mentioned my name, I would have probably been up for attempted murder charges. Nobody mentioned my name, and the bartender didn't know me, so nothing ever came of that. But I'm saying that's kind of where I was at the time. So let me jump ahead here a little bit. Well, the electricians union I mentioned, it was a 1,700-man union, 1,700 members we had. And because of the change in my life, when the change happened, which I'll tell you in a moment, when the change happened, it was such a big deal. That's all they were talking about on jobs, was this guy, how I changed, and now I'm religious. And the business agent, who's in charge of the local, he wanted to talk to me. He wanted me to come in his office because he heard I got religious, and he wanted to find out what happened. I mean, that's how big of a deal it was. It was a very, very big deal. And when I say I changed, wow, all the glory to the Almighty. It had nothing to do with me. Nothing to do with me. I want to tell you the story now of what happened. So anyway, like I said, it was a very big deal with the change that I went through, from where I came from into the night the Almighty got a hold of my life. So I'm going to take this slow here because I get emotional thinking about it. It's been a long time, but it's still incredible in my mind. So anyway, I was sitting at my sister's kitchen table one time. The girl I was living with at the time, Cheryl, who has since passed away, my sister, Diane, who's since passed away, and another woman, Debbie, who is still alive and kicking, from what I understand, a friend of my other sisters. So anyway, we were sitting there at the table the one day, the 4 of us, and the girl I was with, and Cheryl and myself, we just went to see a movie called The Omen. I think this was back in 1979. I think it might have been Gregory Peck in it. It was a popular movie at the time, like the movie The Exorcist was out at the time. Anyway, this is another devil movie here about the Omen. And the little boy had 666 on his forehead. Well, we were sitting there talking about the movie. And I said, "Is there something in the Bible about that, about 666? Nobody knew because none of us read the Bible. None of us were religious. None of us owned a Bible. We were Catholics. Bibles weren't something the Catholic Church told you to read through. They encouraged you not to, as a matter of fact. I don't know if they changed now, but that's the way it was. That's the way it was 40 years ago. So anyway, we didn't have a Bible. So my sister had a daughter who was about 8 or 9 years old at the time, and she was going to church with a Baptist family down the street. So the Baptist family had given her a Bible. So my sister says, Diane says, "I think Sharon has a Bible." So she went and got Sharon's Bible. I'm telling you, I sat there, I didn't know where to look in it. I think I was going to go to the index and look up 666 to see if that was mentioned in there. I don't think this Bible had an index. So I opened it up in the middle of the book, thinking since I don't know where to begin, the front or the back, I figured if I opened in the middle, I'll maybe be able to get an idea of what the book's about. So I opened it up and I was reading the book of Malachi. I'm looking across the way here, a bunch of people screaming. Police on a motorcycle, I'm not sure what's going on. It's by the wall of the old city over here. But the 4 of us were sitting there, and I opened it up, and I'm looking at Malachi. I'm reading Malachi. There was nothing specific in Malachi that I can remember that I read, but as I was reading it, it was literally, it was like the Almighty hit a switch in my head. It was like He turned a switch on. I went from being an agnostic, questioning the existence of a God, to God being the only reality in my life. I mean, I was so confident at that moment that there was a supreme being. There was an Almighty. And He did care about me. So we were sitting there, and my eyes start watering up, and truthfully, I've never been emotional in my life except for this time, and I think in the last 7 months, maybe, since my mother passed away, I seem to get emotional a little easier than I ever have in the past. But anyway, at the time, my eyes start watering up, the hairs on my arms start standing up, and I was like, I didn't know what was happening. And my sister's looking at me, she said, "I think he's cracking up, I think he's going crazy." And I said, "I can't explain what's happening." I said, "Wow, but there is a God." I said at the time, "There is a God." And I said, I remember saying, I remember saying, and I'm a worthless individual. And I don't know what made me say that, because at the time I didn't think I was a worthless individual. I mean, I got in fights a lot, I drank a lot, I did drugs, and I mean, maybe you can laugh and thinking about how could I have not have known I was a worthless individual. But like I said, I thought the way I lived was the way most people live. So anyway, at the time we were sitting there when that happened, that was the end of life the way I knew it. I'm telling you, when I left that day with my girlfriend, went back to our place, I remember on the way back telling her, I said, that's it. I said, I don't even know what sin's about. I said, but I quit sinning. And I didn't know what sin was about. I knew some things, lying, cheating, stealing, immorality, from my Catholic upbringing, those things were wrong. And so they quit that night. They quit. I'm telling you, that was the last time. I would go to bar 3, 4, 5 nights a week. I didn't set foot in a bar since that day. And like I said, that's 37 years ago. As far as alcohol, I didn't touch a drop of alcohol for the next 15 years. The next time I had alcohol was a glass of Manischewitz wine at a Passover Seder in Philadelphia. I mean, everything just stopped that night. The swearing, the words that used to come out of my mouth, I didn't even realize I was saying them. I see people today that talk that way. They obviously don't realize what they're saying. But that's how I was. The girl I was living with, she had a 2 or 3-year-old daughter, Nicole, and at the time, she'd say, do you have to talk that way? Because of the words I was using. And I'd say, what way? What are you talking about? And I didn't even realize I was doing it. That stopped. I smoked 3 packs of cigarettes a day. That was on an average day. If I was going to bars, I'd have one in the ashtray, one in my mouth, and the more beers I had, the more cigarettes I went through. But I had 3 packs of cigarettes a day. That stopped. Everything just stopped. I was into shoplifting real heavy prior to this. I had a nice job. I was a construction worker, electrician. I made good money. And I made more money when I wasn't working by shoplifting. So now that I mention it, I've got to finish that. So I would take just about anything I wanted, I took. I didn't pay for anything. If I wanted food, groceries, clothes, you name it, I just took it. I got very good at it. So when the Almighty got a hold of my life now, I gave it all back. I didn't want to look at any of it. So I literally went back to the stores. I put all the things that I knew where I got from the stores, if I remembered where I got them from. I took it all back to the stores that I had stolen it from. And I'm telling you, for instance, I went to a jewelry store in a Great Northern Mall in Cleveland. Actually, it's in North Royalton, Ohio. There was a little phone kiosk there, and a jewelry store that I stole quite a few things from I could see it from where I was sitting. And so I called them up. This was before cell phones, of course, before internet, before computers. So I called them up on the phone. I'm talking to the woman. I could see her picking up the phone in the jewelry store, and I'm telling her, I said, there's a bag outside your door with a bunch of items in it that I had stolen. I said, I'm returning them. And she puts the phone down, and I'm watching her. She looks into the bag. I mean, I had $500 gold-plated clocks and things like that. Very expensive stuff. And she comes back, and she says, well, what is this? And I said, well, I stole it, and I'm returning it. And I remember her saying, well, I can't take this. And I kind of laughed. I said, miss, it's yours. I don't care what you do with it. I said, I'm returning it. And at the time, I celebrated Christmas and Easter, which, of course, I don't do today. But I remember telling her, I said, have a Christmas party with it. I said, do whatever you want to do with it. It's not mine. It's yours, and I'm returning it. And I did that to every other store that I went to. I started going up and telling the managers about it. I didn't walk in and leave a bag there. I went and I put it on the counter, and I said, I stole this from your store, and I want to return it. And I wish I could have videotaped some of those expressions on those people's faces. But I did that with everything I had. And I went back a few years later when I saved up some money. I went back and some of the things that I stole that I couldn't repay because I had sold. I went back and I wrote out checks to some people. Not a lot of money, and in no way was it to compensate for what I had stolen and sold. But I went back and just more like a token thing, I guess it was. I'd write them out a check. I went back to one store where I stole a bunch of power tools. I happened to work in the store, and the power tools were all in the window. When I showed up for work in the morning, I unlocked the door, and I was with a friend of mine. The glass window, the showcase window was broke. So I loaded up my car with the tools, and I called the police and told them somebody broke in, stole all the tools. And now this is 6 years later, whatever. I called that individual up, and I told him, I said, I'm the one that did that. And I said, I'd like to make restitution for some of what I'd taken. So if I can write you out a check for $300, one fella got half and I got the other half. He says, yeah, write out the check and send it to me. So I sent it to him. And at the time, that might have been close because the power tools back then, like I think about it, circular saws, 25, 30 bucks. I mean, reciprocal saws, everything was much cheaper, of course, 40 years ago, 30-some years ago. So I went back to all the stores and I wrote out checks, like I said, a token. I went to one store, a health food store. I had stolen an ionizer. I know you're not interested in all these stealing stories, but I'm just, again, giving you an idea where I was coming from. So I stole an ionizer, and at the time it cost $99. So I'm telling the guy, I went in, I told him, I said, I'm the one that took it. And he says, I remember that. And I said, well, I want to write you out a check for it. And I said, it was $99. And he said, no, they're only $89. And I said, when I stole it, it was $99. He said, well, they're only $89 today. So make the check out for $89. So I wrote him out a check for $89. But anyway, I did that with everything I had. So everything I had was gone. My apartment now was pretty much empty. Because most of what I had furniture in, of course. But I mean, most of the little odds and ends that I had were all stolen, so I returned them all. So that was a part of my life prior to the Almighty getting a hold of my life. So that all stopped at the time. And like I said, on the way home with my girlfriend, I told her, that's it, I'm through sinning, and I don't even know what sin is. From that night on, she slept in the bedroom, I slept on the couch. The kissing got down to, and that was it. I mean, that wasn't gonna, I felt like anything was wrong, and even being with her. After a month or two of living there, and people telling people on jobs, every job that I went on, construction jobs, I'm not kidding, when I'd walk on a job, they'd be like, wow, what happened to you? We heard you got religious. And then I'd say how I'm still living with this woman, but we're not doing anything, immoral. Yeah, right. Well, they didn't believe that. So after a couple months, I remember telling her that we can't continue to do this because even though we're not doing anything wrong, it doesn't look right. So anyway, that came to an end. And so that's what happened prior to that. So when the Almighty got a hold of my life that night, like I said, I didn't know anything about the Bible, much about the Bible. I was brought up a Catholic. I thought what the Catholic Church was saying was true. So I started reading the Bible on my own. I didn't have anybody telling me what the Bible said, which was an enormous advantage. I didn't have anybody telling me it said this or it said that, or give me the Gospel of John and tell me to go home and get saved. I didn't have that. I went home and I read it for the next month or two. I took off work. Like I said, I work construction, so I can do that. I'd get a layoff and I'd sit home and I read the Bible. That's all I did. I'm talking, when I say that's all I did, I mean that's all I did. It wasn't like I did it for an hour or two every day. That's all I did. And that's pretty much all I've done since then. I'll tell you some of the stories in a moment. But so I started reading it, and it seemed like everything that I read, no drunkard shall inherit the kingdom. That's me. I had a friend living with me at the time, Jeff, and I was living with my girlfriend and his friend of mine. And I'd tell Jeff, I said, everything I'm reading, no immoral person, no drunkard, no liar, no thief, no this and that. I'm like, wow, everything this is talking about is me. And it says they're not going to inherit the kingdom. And then I read verses like the Messiah saying, I'd like to read a few of them now. Yeah, let me read them instead of just quoting them. I read verses like the Messiah saying in Luke 14, for instance. And when I read these verses, I believed them. There was nobody there telling me. I know you may be thinking, well, I believe them too. No, most people don't believe them. I often say now that if people actually believed in an eternity, that there was an eternity, they would live their lives much differently than they are now. Most people say they believe that, but they don't. Because if they did, if you believed that there was something waiting beyond this world for you, in a paradise, an eternity in paradise, and all you had to do to get there was to obey the Almighty, obey the commandments, walk as the Messiah walked, you would do it. When people say I can't do it, it's because they don't really believe what they say they believe. I'll talk more about that in a moment. But when I read these passages here, like in Luke chapter 14, let me read a couple of them if I can. Well, actually, Luke 14 is not the one I wanted to look at, but I'll read this one. Luke 14, 25, 26, 27. Let me read that. Luke 14, 25. Now large crowds were going along with him, and he turned and said to them, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own mother and father and mother, wife, children, brothers, sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry his own stake or cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. So he says a number of times, well here, let me explain that since I read it. It wasn't the verse I was planning on reading. But he says, unless you hate your mother, father, sister, and brothers. I'm going to tell you some stories about some priests that I talked to after I started reading the Bible, because I couldn't figure out why they were saying what they were saying when the Bible said just the opposite. So I was talking to a priest one time. I'll finish this story later on. But I was talking to a priest one time, and he quoted this verse to me. when I was telling him, I think I understand the Bible. And he said, okay, what does this mean, unless you hate him? I said the word hate would be better translated there to love less. That our love for our mother, father, sisters, wives, brothers, and so forth should be so much less than our love for the Almighty that it would look as if it was hate. Now, let me give you an example of what I believe that's talking about, because I didn't want to get off in this passage here, but since I read it, let me try to explain it the way I understand it. You know, that if let's say, like birthday parties, Christmas, Easter, things like that, I don't do any of those things anymore, and I don't believe any follower of the Messiah would, because they're pagan holidays, and I'll discuss them more later on. I hope you don't get offended and turn this video off now, because I said that. Give me a chance to explain it in a moment. But anyway, I don't observe those things anymore, so because of that, when I said I'm not doing Christmas anymore, that caused a lot of hard feelings with a lot of people. Because I'm not going to go over their houses, I'm not celebrating Christmas trees and Santa Clauses and Easter bunnies, I'm not doing that anymore. And so people would get upset about it. But my love for the Almighty was greater than my love for the people that were getting upset. So I wouldn't do it, regardless of what somebody else, how they felt or what they thought about me. So I think that's what the Almighty's talking, that's what the Messiah's talking about here, that our love for Him should be first, over our love for anybody else. We're not going to compromise. Say you're married to somebody, a spouse, and your wife or your husband, whatever, and you keep the Sabbath day, the Shabbat, the fourth commandment. You realize the Sabbath is on the seventh day of the week and not the first. And you come home, say a husband comes home and he tells his wife, the husband's the head of the family. 1 Corinthians 11, verse 3, Paul says, it's a little bit chilly out here as well. Paul says that the Messiah is the head of the man's the head of the Messiah is the head of the man's the head of the woman, and the Almighty's and Yahweh is the head of the Messiah. 1 Corinthians 11:3. So the man is the head of the woman as the Messiah is the head of the man. So the man's in charge of his house, and there's other passages I could use to support what I just said. So the man's in charge of his house. So he comes home and says, honey, we got to observe the Shabbat from now on. Then that's what has to be done. So that's what has to be done. So you got to start keeping the Sabbath. And if the wife says, well, I'm not going to do that, the man has to make a choice. He's responsible for what goes on in his house. So his wife has to do that. If he's going to do it, his wife has to do that. So he has to take a stand. Who does he love more, his wife or the Almighty? Is he going to obey the Almighty and observe the Shabbat and make sure that his family is observing the Shabbat? And when we talk about the Sabbath a little bit, if I get to that, when you read about the Sabbath in Exodus chapter 20, about anybody in your household, even your animals are supposed to rest. Anyone within your gates are supposed to rest, including your wife and family. So if the wife doesn't want to observe the Sabbath, the husband's going to have to make a choice. I had a rabbi up here in a town called Afula. I'm kind of getting a little away from my testimony now, but Afula, and he would drive me to Tiberias, from Afula to Tiberias for this Bible study that I was given every week. We were driving back one day, and he says, Reuben, his name happened to be Ariel. He says, Reuben, he says, what if you had a wife that wouldn't observe the Shabbat? And he was talking about his wife, because I knew she didn't observe it. They made a pretense of observing it, but it was obvious to me she didn't. And I said, I would explain to her, I said, honey, this is what we have to do. It's not an option. We don't have a choice. We have to observe the Sabbath. The Almighty commanded it. This is one of His commandments. And I said, if she wouldn't do it, I said, maybe I'd ask her with tears in my eyes, please, this is the way we have to live. And if she still refused, I said, I'd have to divorce her. I don't want to get off on the big subject about marriage and divorce as much as I'd like to. We could talk about it another time, but I told this rabbi that. And I think 6 months later, I understand he got divorced, which, in my opinion, he had no other option. Anyway, when I told him that, he says, he looked at me, he's driving his car, and he says, I agree with you. He says, but not a lot of people would. And I said, I realize a lot of people wouldn't agree with that. I said, but that's Torah. And so anyway, what I'm saying is, so the love to hate your mother, father, sisters, brothers, your wife, children, and so forth, it doesn't mean literal hate. It means to love them so much less than you love the Almighty. Meaning you're going to put Him first in your life, not your mother, brothers, sisters, and so forth. And so that's what it's talking about there. So this priest asked me that, and I explained it to him in that way. So after reading the Bible, when I start reading it, like I said, that everything, all these verses I read, Luke 13, 21 to 23 there, I want to take a look at some more verses about Luke 13, let's back up a page here, 22 and 23 and 4. I read this, and I believed it. He says, no, it says, he was passing through from city to village to another, teaching and preaching as he went to Jerusalem. And someone said to him, Master, are there just a few who are being saved? And he said to them, strive to enter through the narrow gate, for many, I tell you, will seek to enter and will not be able to. He's saying many are going to seek to find salvation, and they're not going to be able to. I read that, and I thought, wow, what is he talking about? In Christianity, they say you bow your head, you say a prayer, and you're in, you're there. A lot of them even teach that after you say that prayer, that nothing you can do can ever take you away from the salvation that you think you just received. So what is the Messiah talking about, striving to enter at the narrow gate? So I read verses like this, and I'm thinking, wow, this isn't what people are talking to me about. In Matthew chapter 7. Matthew chapter 7. I'd like to read a couple of these. And like I said, this is what I was reading at the time. I wasn't talking to anybody about the Bible at the time. So I'm reading these verses, and like I said, I'm believing them. I'm thinking, this is true. I had nobody to tell me that he really didn't mean what he said. I believe that what he said, he meant. Luke chapter 7, verse 13 and 14. It says, enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is broad that leads to destruction, and many are there those who enter through it. The gate is small and the way is narrow that leads to life, and few there be who find it. Who find it. He says few are going to find that narrow gate. He doesn't just say they're going to have a hard time getting through it like he said back in Luke 13. He says few are going to be able to find that narrow gate. And I remember reading these to myself, and I'm thinking, wow, what is that about? I thought it was just a matter of accepting Jesus or something, to be saved. But I'm reading these passages, and it seemed to be more than that. So that's why I spent all the time reading the Bible that I did. Turn to Matthew chapter 10. With the plan of salvation, never does the Bible say bow your head and say a prayer. I realize there's a verse in 1 John that says if we pray, he'll forgive us. John's talking to believers there. I have an article on the website pertaining to that passage. If you go to the website, I have a number of articles and videos there explaining a lot of these passages that I'm bringing up now. But there's never a plan of salvation that's not bowing your head and saying a prayer. This is the plan of salvation that I'm about to read here. Matthew chapter 10. And again he says in verse 37, he who loves father and mother more than me is not worthy of me. He who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And he who does not take up his cross or his stake and follow after me is not worthy of me. He who has found his life will lose it, and he who lost his life will find it. Or he who lost his life for my sake will find it. So again, when I read this for the first time, imagine the first time. I'm sure these are old passages you've heard hundreds of times talked about. But I thought I had to lose my life for the Messiah's sake. I had to let him live his life in me. Paul says in Galatians 2:20, he says, I no longer live, but Messiah lives in me. I believe that. I thought, wow, this is what I'm going to have to do. If I want to inherit eternal life, this is what I have to do. And I believed it. So anyway, after reading the Bible for, I think it was more like 2 months, I remember telling my friend that I was with, that was staying with me at the time, I said, I'm going to do it. I said, whatever I have to do, I'm going to do it. I'm going to tell him I'm going to give my life to him. I'm not living my life for myself anymore. And I called my uncle up at the time, who I thought was a religious man. I thought a lot of people were religious at the time. So I called him up and I asked him what I had to do. I said, I want to give my life to Jesus. And he said, oh, good, yeah, great. Come to church on Sunday. And he says, when they have the altar call, you can go up and say the sinner's prayer. And I'm thinking, I've never read that in the Bible, but if this is what people do, then I guess this is what I have to do. So I went to his church that Sunday morning, and they had an altar call. And I went up to the altar, and I'll tell you, I was a broken man. I cried for about 20 minutes. I couldn't stop. I mean, to think, because I went from questioning the existence of a God to knowing that God actually cared about me, that he was concerned about my life, and that was just an incredible, incredible, moving experience for me. It was like, wow. And it's been that way ever since. I tell people today I feel like a spoiled child. I am so confident that the Almighty is with me. I'll tell you some stories in a moment. But the Almighty is with me, that I take it for granted a lot of times. I don't even question it. It's like I don't, I know he's just there. Nothing can possibly happen to me, and I'm convinced of that he's not in direct control of it. So whatever happens, whether it's good or bad, or whether it seems good or bad to me, it's what's supposed to happen. Because I don't live my life the way I want to live it anymore. I live it the way he says I have to live it. And I'm very confident that he honors his side. Not only am I confident, I'm positive that he watches over me constantly. And like I said, I'll tell you some stories throughout this testimony here. So anyway, when I read these things and I gave my life to him, I went to the altar call, I prayed, and I must have cried for about 20 minutes. My uncle calls me up that night, and he's telling me that they have an evening service. And he says at the evening service, the minister gets up and he's walking around. I think I mentioned let me pause here a moment. This is a beautiful little spot I'm sitting in, but there's a walkway in front of me, and you might have seen me say hello to people walking by. And occasionally tour groups walk by. I don't know if I mentioned that or not. But if they do, I'm going to have to pause the video for a moment. There's a number of people off to my left. They chose to go another way. But I wanted you to realize what's going on if I do have to pause it. So anyway, my uncle calls me that night after the evening service, and he says the minister got up and he's looking around the group, as if he was looking for somebody. And he says, there was a fellow here this morning that was truly saved. Well, of course, he was talking because of the way I was so broken at the time. But the truth is, I was not saved. I'll discuss it more as I go along. I didn't know what salvation was at the time. I didn't know who the Almighty was at the time. I didn't know what he expected of me at the time. I mean, I knew the things like the drink and the swearing, the drugs, the immorality. Of course, I understood that, which I think is pretty much understood by most people. It used to be anyway. Most people in society today. Not so much today, obviously. But anyway, at the time, he said there was a fellow here this morning. He was truly saved. And again, because of the way I was such a broken man at the time. And like I said, my life just it was changed drastically, and that's all I did was read the Bible after that. So now we're getting into the good part. We got by the fights, the stealing, the drugs, the drinking, the immorality, all that the Almighty took away from me at that moment, sitting there at my sister's kitchen table. I'm telling you, that was the end of it. It was the end of it all. It was over with. It was literally over with. For the most part, well, not for the most part. Of course, I've never gotten in a fight since then. And I try very hard never get in arguments, and I don't get in arguments anymore with people. I usually walk away if I see it's not going to be a good situation. I don't want to argue with anybody. And almost never do I. I can think of a couple times that over the last 30-some years that might have not been the case. But when I did get in arguments, it's about the religion, about the Bible, my faith. And I don't argue with people about that. I usually get a little heated up when I'm talking to leaders that are misleading people. Those are the people that really affect me. Those people I feel like I can't walk away from. I have to stand there and expose what they're saying as being untrue to the people that are following them. And maybe I'll talk about stories as I go along here, times that happened. But that's pretty much the only time that I ever get excited, is talking about the Bible with so-called leaders, religious leaders. So I start reading the Bible at that time, and I opened up let me back up a little bit here. I was divorced, and my wife had remarried, and she married a fellow in the Coast Guard, and they moved down to Elizabethtown, New Jersey. I'm mentioning these things, and I'm hoping that somebody might watch this that knows somebody I'm talking about. I'm not going to mention any names in the way of, in a defamatory way or anything like that about anybody. And I would never mention their real names, except names of people that I know that I would love to see again. So anyway, my wife got remarried at the time, moved down to New Jersey. Husband was in the Coast Guard, and we had to make an agreement before she left that I would get my son, who was about 4 or 5 years old at the time, for a month in the summer. Well, I just started reading the Bible now, maybe 2 months after I started reading it. Is when the month to get my son was supposed to be. So I called her up, and her husband got on the phone, and he says, well, we decided not to do that. We're not going to allow him to come up there for the month. And I says, wow, what are you talking about? That was the arrangement we had. He says, well, we're not going to do that. He says, I'm sorry. He said, but we're not going to do that. And my flesh kind of came back a little bit right away. I know in the past what I would have done, and this is what I said to him. I said, I'll tell you what, you're not sorry yet. You're going to be, because I'm going to leave right now, and I'll be at your door tomorrow morning. And as I was saying that, he said something about God or the Bible or something. And I'll tell you, it was like a slap in the face from the Almighty. I'm professing to be a follower of the Messiah. I'm saying the Messiah is living in me, and I'm talking that way. Wow, when he said that, he stopped me right in my tracks, I'll tell you. And I told him, I said, I'm sorry for what I just said. I said, I'm a believer. I'm a believer in the Messiah. And he couldn't believe it because of my past, because of things I got involved in. So he asked me if I'd go talk to his brother, who was up in Cleveland at the time, and if I talked to him, who's a pastor in the group. So I agreed to do that. So I went and talked to his brother. and who was a pastor of a group at the time, had a home group. And his brother called him up and assured him that yes, that I was sincere and that I was truly giving my life to the Messiah. And so anyway, I did end up seeing my son that summer. I'm trying to think of why I even told you that story. So as I start reading the Bible, oh yeah, because when I joined his house group then, I opened up a 4-family house for kids on the poor side of town. It was in a lower section of town. And the people that lived there, I allowed them to stay there for a month to save their rent, stay there free for a month to save their rent, and they could have a down payment to put someplace else, a deposit. So then when they moved out, I opened it up as a community center for children in a poor part of town. It was going fantastic. And I'm going to pause the video here, and I'll pick it up in part 2. Pick up talking about the house, the community center that I opened up for kids. I want to thank you for your time and for viewing this, and we'll continue later in the moment. Thank you.